Our guest is David Finkel. He's a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist for the Washington Post and a MacArthur Fellow. David is also the author of the new book, Thank You for Your Service. David, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Dennis.
Good to have you here. What a powerful book you've written. Thank you for your service. My Lord, I think probably many of us have said that to a veteran that we see at some point. Thank you for your service. This is a very important interview for folks at home to take a look at and to watch and to listen very carefully to what you've done. Let's start with Michael Emery.
Okay.
Michael Emery, who is he? What does his T-shirt say? What is his body? What is his mind? What is his emotions? Where are they today?
Well, there's a bit of a backstory to Michael Emery and to all these people, and thank you for your service. The book is a sequel to another book I had done called The Good Soldiers. And that was a bit of reporting and writing about an U.S. Army infantry battalion that was sent into George W. Bush's surge in 2007 in Iraq. And all of these people, including Michael Emery, were members of this battalion. Emery was a guy who very early in the deployment was on a rooftop during a mission, and out there was a sniper with a pretty good scope who had a clean shot into Michael Emery's head, and down he went. It was a loud shot too, and down he went with a grievous injury, and by rights he should be dead, but he didn't die on the rooftop. He was dragged off, and this involves another character, which I hope we'll talk about him later. But Emery was a guy, like I said, he should have died. He didn't die. He was airlifted out, first to Germany, eventually to Bethesda, outside of Washington, D.C. for recovery. And this is a guy, not only did he live, he wasn't expected to walk, because he lost a good chunk of his brain. He walks. He wasn't expected to talk. He talks. So in some ways, and to use Army parlance, he's an example of what the Army likes to call resilience. But the closer you look at the lives of Michael Emery, or just about anyone in this battalion who fought at that time, resilience comes with complications. And Emery is partly paralyzed. He has trouble remembering things, sequencing things. And life, like it is for so many of these folks, is almost like a day-to-day act of willing yourself into the next phase of what comes once you've been to war and have come home from war.
He visits Paul Schumann.
Adam Schumann, yeah.
Adam Schumann, right. Later on, and he's wearing a T-shirt, and the T-shirt says,
yeah, isn't that funny? It says, "What did you do for your country?" And then on the front, and on the back it says, "I took a bullet in the head for mine." Ooh. And he says he wears that shirt so when he's around, out, away from his trailer and in town, people who see him won't think this is just some guy who got dinged up in a drunk driving accident, that something more profound happened to him. 2
million Americans have served in both wars?
Right. 2.5 million have joined since 9/11. Of the 2.5 million, 2 million have deployed either into Iraq or Afghanistan. And look, the fact is, of the 2 million, as I say, and thank you for your service, as in any war, most came home okay. And this needs to be emphasized. In some cases, these people are better for the experience of having been in war. But there's a substantial subset. The best estimates at this point are about 25% of these folks.
500,000?
500,000 who have returned with some level of psychological wound. They now get to spend years, if not the rest of their lives, trying to outrun and recover from.
You call it the invisible wounds of war.
Yeah.
So there's life after war. And for these people, we're talking about, everybody's heard the phrase post-traumatic stress disorder.
Yeah.
Traumatic brain injury.
Right.
What are the symptoms that these guys are dealing with?
It can be bad dreams. It can be a little bit of forgetfulness. It can be increasing anxiety. It can be depression, and then just take it up the ladder into suicidal ideation, suicidal attempts, and suicidal successes. And again, I just want to be careful. I'm not trying to perpetuate any stereotype that every soldier who serves comes home broken, but I also don't want to back off from what I found in the reporting of this book, which is that a substantial number are wounded. And,
so you're saying that some are okay, some are not so okay. Of these 500,000, some get better and some don't. Huh?
Yeah, and it's a great mystery who's who and why that happens. But of course some get better.
And the impact on families is horrific, isn't it? For a person who's waking up in the middle of the night screaming, or consistently fighting, or seeing Iraqis in the bathtub, as you say.
Well, you can imagine this, right? I mean, let's be clear about these folks who went into that moment. You and I can disagree, if we want to, about the policies that caused these wars. But these folks are the far end of policy. They're not the ones who framed it. They're the ones who went to carry it out. And in 2007, if you think back, when the surge started, the war had seemed to have arrived at almost its lost moment. And to some people, that's another way of saying it's tragic moment. And then instead of backing off, Bush announces this thing called the surge. And here's this battalion of 800 guys in Fort Riley, Kansas. And look, most of these guys, 18, 19, 20 years old.
Why did they enlist?
A variety of reasons. Sense of mission, patriotism after 9/11. Some, it's the only job they could find. Economically depressed times, and they needed money.
Did they know what they were getting in for?
None of them knew what they were getting into, even the ones who had been in previous versions. I mean, that's the thing. You don't know. And these guys, almost to a man, if you'll permit a bit of generalizing, almost to a man, these guys were filled with a sense of not only zeal, but a young man's invincibility. They were going to go over and they were going to win this thing. And if other people got injured, it's because they were not well trained. And these guys, they knew they were.
It was the they and not the me.
Yeah. And then they went. And then, they lost their first guy. And then they lost their second guy. And then, this area they were in was just seeded with so many roadside bombs, they couldn't get them all. And they kept blowing up. And as the injuries mounted, the invincibility faded, and there was a degradation of the psyche that began to take place. So by the time they came home 14 months later, I mean, of course they were changed.
Let's hold on that note, David. Say to the folks at home, we're talking with David Finkel, who's editor, reporter, Washington Post, MacArthur Award winner, Pulitzer Prize winner, and has written this incredible book. Thank you for your service. We're going to take a little break. Back on the other side with more with David. Sit tight. This is America and the World. This is America is brought to you by the National Education Association, the U.S.-China Education Trust, and the F.Y. Chang Foundation. The League of Arab States, representing 350 million people in 22 member countries. The Rotendaro Family Trust. The Embassy Series, uniting people through musical diplomacy, presenting international artists in diplomatic settings. And Ventana Productions, television facilities, editing, and distribution services. It's a different kind of war, isn't it? It's I call it a war, Iraq and Afghanistan, two different wars, but for the sake of our conversation, or correct me if I'm wrong, I think of it as one war.
Well, but each war has so many wars within it, and so one thing that I do in The Good Soldiers is I begin every chapter with a quote from then President Bush, something he said on the day or around the day that a particular chapter is taking place. And it's not to poke fun or create, it's a very simple reason. It's just to show that at the high levels, when the war is being fought out of the Pentagon, the White House, Congress, it's a different war than the same war is at the far end when you're on the ground.
360?
360.
No battle lines?
No uniforms, no line to advance.
Who's the enemy?
Who isn't the enemy?
Who isn't the enemy?
Right?
How interesting.
It's an interesting way to think about it, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So there might be the most benign action taking place. It's a kid in Iraq who sees this passing convoy of American soldiers in waves, right? So what's going on in that moment? What the kid is seeing is perhaps not a convoy of soldiers, but these heavily armored Humvees, and behind really, really thick glass is some vague image of a guy with barely any skin showing, helmet, Kevlar, the whole deal, raising a gloved hand, iPro, raising a gloved hand and waving back. That's his association. What's the soldier seeing?
Yeah.
Is it a kid, or is it a kid signaling somebody, hit the trigger, now's the time to blow him up?
IEDs all over the place.
In this part of Baghdad.
Wow.
Yeah, the weapon of choice was this thing called an explosively formed penetrator, and this was $100 to make, maybe. I guess that's the best guess. And it was just this tube filled with explosives, and attached to one end is this copper disc about the size of a dinner plate, and out the other end, if it wasn't a cell phone trigger, it would be this wire that would just kind of wind its way through the shadows into some shadow that was some guy's hand waiting to push the trigger when the convoy hit a certain point.
You were there.
Yeah, but here's the thing that happened is if he hit the button at the right time, and more often than not he did, this thing would blow, and this copper plate would be propelled forward so quickly. Well, it's invisible, of course, and it becomes semi-molten. It just basically burns through whatever it hits. And if it was well aimed, it burns through a 500-600-pound armored door, just right through it, knife through a butter, and it goes inside where there are 5 American soldiers. And then what happens next is absolute chaos.
5 men in a Humvee, huh?
Sure. And out they went every day. So you would see, I talk about invincibility sort of fading. What you would see these soldiers do, these 19-year-old guys, is make these it was always so moving to me, these breathtaking adjustments to what they knew was waiting for them out there. And so you would have a gunner, the guy in the middle. If he's not up in a sling, his feet were down on the ground, and he would deliberately stand with one foot in front of the other, so if this thing came through, it would take off one of his feet instead of both of his feet.
You say it wasn't about winning, it wasn't about losing, it was just trying.
To them, eventually.
Trying and waiting to go
But
home.
isn't that what happens in every war? Guys, soldiers, Marine, whoever it is, they initially go with a sense of mission, and by the end of it, the mission fades, and you're just basically in it for the guy next to you. And then they come home.
Will you read? Yeah, I want to talk about them coming home. But will you read this little section? Take your time.
Okay.
I think it's so graphic. Your writing is so impeccable. Take your time, because it paints such a picture.
Thanks. I'd like to read this. And look, obviously, when I talk, I get a little spun up about this, but I'm glad.
And should.
But I'm glad to be able to read this passage. And I think it actually is a better description of what I was just saying. During the war, every day would begin the same way. The soldiers would tuck Lucky Charms into their pockets and joke about their final words. They would gather in quick circles to pray and smoke the last cigarette of their lives. They would tighten their body armor, push in their earplugs, lower their shatter-resistant sunglasses, and tug on their burn-resistant gloves. And when someone called out, "Let's go," they would climb into their Humvees and go, knowing full well what was waiting for them down the road. They had seen Harrelson's Humvee rise into the air and burst into fire. They had seen Emery get shot in the head and collapse in his own spreading blood. They had seen soldiers lose legs, lose arms, lose feet, lose hands, lose fingers, lose toes, and lose eyes. And they had heard them, too, in the aid station, in whatever pain is enough pain to make a 19-year-old scream. They had heard a soldier ask, "Is anything sticking out of my head?" after a mortar attack. They had heard a doctor say, I'm hoping," about a soldier who in a few minutes would be dead. They had heard a soldier tell a dying soldier as he stuffed what was left of him into a Humvee, "You're going to have to move your feet so I can close the door." They had heard a soldier who had lost his right leg and right arm and most of his left arm saying, "Ow, it hurts, it hurts." They had heard a sergeant who was they had heard a sergeant who was watching something skid across the floor of the aid station, which had fallen from a shredded soldier who was about to die, say with sadness, "That's a toe." They had heard IEDs ask in the most hopeful voice a soldier could ever muster, "What happened to Harrelson?" They had heard Galembi say to Schumann, "None of this would have happened if you were there." Most of all, they had heard explosion after explosion and seen dozens of Humvees disappear into breathtaking clouds of fire and debris, and by the end, most of them had been inside such a cloud themselves, blindly feeling around in those initial moments to determine if they were alive or dead or intact or in pieces, as their ears rang and their hearts galloped and their souls darkened and their eyes occasionally filled with tears. So they knew, and yet day after day they would go out anyway, which eventually came to be what the war was about. Not winning, not losing, nothing so grand, just trying until it was time to go home and discovering that life after the war turned on trying again. Yeah, thanks for asking me to read that.
Thank you for reading it. So powerful.
I mean, that was the deal. That was the everyday.
Every day.
And it's worth pointing out to anyone listening that these books I've written, I mean, this is not made up stuff. These are, most of all, books dependent on journalism and observed journalism. I mean, this was stuff, I'm not saying the books are about me. They're not. There's no agenda in the books. But it's based on observed reporting for the most part, and these are things that were happening every day in Iraq and Afghanistan, just like in the new book, the things I described, they're happening now. This is not some far off thing, some easily dismissible thing. It's stuff that went on and is going on right now.
500,000 come home with these invisible wounds of war. When you're talking about statistics, there's a statistic that jumped out at me. 11% of the people who came home, amputation. 11%. That was just something.
I think that's the. I think that is the stat
in my mind.
Yeah, but
but the 500,000 who came home.
Yeah, but again, these are the 500,000. Some of them have physical wounds, but the 500,000, we're talking about PTSD. We're talking about traumatic brain injury, which is an injury when your brain basically gets rattled around so hard in your head, it has psychological consequences. Physical, you're able to map them physically, but there's psychological residue as well.
Every war has an afterwar, you say.
I do.
Let's talk about Sergeant Schumann.
Okay.
Adam Schumann.
Okay.
Tell us the backstory about his youth, his marriage, his kids, his service in the military, what he experiences there, and what happens when he comes home. Take your time.
Well, I'm afraid you're going to think I'm incapable of a short answer.
but I've been through, once before I said to a guest, take as much time as you want.
Okay. Well, Schumann, you know, I have, it's been 7 years since I started reporting on and writing about and thinking about these folks, and maybe Schumann most of all. Adam Schumann, the way I met Adam is there was a point in the deployment when things were a little quiet, and I was asking around, so who's a great soldier? Not just a good soldier, who is a great soldier? And one officer mentioned this guy, Schumann. And a little time passed, and I had a quiet day and decided to go find Schumann. So I go into his little hooch, and there he is, the great soldier, you know, and he's this gaunt, haunted-looking man in shorts, sitting by himself on his bunk. And I introduced myself, and he said, "I guess I know why you're here." And I said, "Well, I hear you're a pretty great soldier." He said, "Well, maybe so, but I'm about to leave the war." And it was true. This guy was on his third deployment. He had been in combat about 1,000 days. And look, even if you go back to the height of World War II, I think the standing rule was 150 days or so in combat, you got pulled back from the line. Take a rest. 1,000 days, and it had gotten to him. When we talked earlier about Michael Emery being shot in the head, and they had to get him down 3 flights of stairs, they were having such a hard time getting the litter up the stairs. It was a strange stairway. So finally Schumann put big old Emery across his back, and kind of this fireman's carry, to huff and puff his way down the stairs to get Emery medevaced out of there. And it just so happened, because of the angle of things, and forgive the imagery, but it's true, that much of the blood coming out of Emery's head kept draining into Adam Schumann's mouth. And on the day I met him, he was still tasting that blood. And that and an assortment of other things, the accumulation, this great soldier had cracked open, and he was going home. So he was alone. I start hanging out with him. The time comes for him to leave and go to the helicopter, and I walked him to the helicopter, and along the way he stopped, and there was a phone bank, and he called his wife and said he was on his way. And she said at one point, "I'm worried about what you might do." And he assured her nothing was going to happen, but he hung up and said, "I don't know what I'm going to do when I get home. I don't know." Gets to the line for the helicopter. Think about this. Maybe 6, 7 guys in line. He's in the back. Helicopters come in. Everybody moves forward. Schumann gets to the front. Guy stops him. And he hollers over the noise of the helicopter, "Next one's yours." Everybody leaves. Now it's just Schumann standing there. Eventually, the next set of helicopters come in, and they both have big red crosses on the side. And, you know, there's a moment when Schumann gets it, and that's the moment. And these are, as I write in the book, these are the helicopters for the injured and the dead. And that's who he's become. He's injured, he's dead, he's done. And instead of feeling, in that moment, a sense of pride over, again, not the policies, but how he had performed as a soldier. Instead of feeling a pride, this guy is cloaked in some serious guilt for having to leave early and walking out of the war and leaving his guys behind. And, you know, that's the deal. That's Schumann in the first book. And the second book, Thank You for Your Service, begins 2 years later with this scene that's happening now in Kansas. Adam and Saskia, his wife, have just had a baby. It's the middle of the night in winter in Kansas. And Saskia is just so tired. And she's wondering, can she trust this man? And she hands over the baby and says, "I need to get a little sleep." Adam says, "Don't worry, I got it." She falls asleep. A second later, he falls asleep. And the baby's rolling out of his arms and off his chest and over the side of the bed. And the sound of the baby hitting the floor is what wakes them up. The baby's okay, but it's a brutal moment for this family. And his recovery is off and running at that point. So that's Adam Schumann, and you know, he's alive. He's with us to this very day. We were talking this morning, texting, and he's better. He's not perfect, but I guess the book really follows an arc from that first homecoming when he was feeling so guilty, to a few years later, a chance at a second homecoming with a slightly redemptive feel to it.
What led him to the furnace room?
Well, the furnace room was the worst room in their house. It was down in the basement of this little house they owned in Kansas, and it was just, you know, I don't know. It's a great question. It all led him to the furnace room. It's all of it. But that particular day. That particular day, it was one more fight between Adam and Saskia, and this time Adam decided to pack and leave, and Saskia went through his things and saw that he had tucked a little handgun at the bottom of his duffel bag and held and said, "What's this? You can't take this." And he said, "I don't know, I'll pawn it, I'll need money." And she said, "You can't take it," and he disappears into their bedroom and comes out holding a shotgun and takes the button, is jabbing her with it, wanting her to shoot him, to end this. And the thing is, Saskia, by that point, who had been so filled with hope on the day he came home, had reached the point where she just wanted to pull the trigger, and then she wanted to pull it again. She didn't, of course. You know, she stepped out, she calmed down, and then when she came in, Adam was nowhere in sight, and she looked all around the house, and finally she went down to the awful furnace room, and there he was, sitting on a chair, gun propped against his chin, and then began, well, a pretty sad, brutal scene in their unfolding lives. Yeah. Anyway.
But you texted him today, huh?
Yeah. Yeah.
Your move, just telling the story.
Well, sure. I mean, look, these are agenda-free books, but it doesn't mean that I wasn't affected by what's going on.
For information about my new book, The Chance of a Lifetime, and online video for all This Is America programs, visit our website, thisisamerica.net. And now you can follow us on Facebook and Twitter. This is America is brought to you by the National Education Association, the U.S.-China Education Trust, and the F.Y. Chang Foundation. The League of Arab States, representing 350 million people in 22 member countries. The Rotendaro Family Trust. The Embassy Series, uniting people through musical diplomacy, presenting international artists in diplomatic settings. And Ventana Productions, television facilities, editing, and distribution services.